Today we're looking at 9.1 and we're going to be talking about imaginary numbers. So our learning target is I can simplify imaginary numbers. So we're going to be talking about I, which is our imaginary unit that's going to help us solve things before that we said had no solution. So before, back in unit 3, anytime we saw something like this where we said simplify square root of negative 18 or the square root of negative 64, we always said there's no solution. We cannot take the square root of a negative number. However, we actually can, but we can't do that within the real number system. So that means we now are going to be looking at the imaginary number system in order to be able to solve things like the square root of negative 18. So imaginary numbers. So we have a bunch of different number systems within our real number system. We have natural numbers, which are just 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we have whole numbers, so we can include 0. Then we have integers, so we can include negative numbers, and rational numbers, so that we can have square roots and things like that. So now we are looking at the imaginary number system, and it's designed so that negative numbers can have square roots. So before, if we had something like I squared plus 1 equals 0, actually we had x squared plus 1 equals 0, we would subtract over 1 and we'd have x squared equals negative 1. So then, oh, no solution, can't take the square root of the negative number. However, now we're introducing I, which now allows us to take the square root of a negative. So I is going to represent the square root of negative 1. So the imaginary numbers consist of all numbers where we have a real number and an imaginary number. We have this imaginary unit so that we can solve all different types of problems that now have a negative under the square root. So the big idea that's going to take us through this unit is we have this imaginary unit called I, and I is equal to the square root of negative 1. So anytime we have the square root of negative 1, we're going to use I. Now, if we have I squared, we're taking the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1. And if we multiply two square roots, our square root cancels, and we're just left with negative 1. So I squared is equal to negative 1. If we have I cubed, we have square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1. So the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 gives us negative 1 times the square root of negative I, or square root of negative 1 gives us negative 1I. Because the square root of negative 1 is I. So then the square root, or I to the fourth, is the square root of negative 1 4 times. So if I have the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 is negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 is negative 1. If I multiply those together, I get 1. So I have I is equal to negative 1, square root of negative 1. I squared is equal to negative 1. I cubed is equal to negative I, and I to the fourth is 1. Those are going to be that's your big idea. You want to make sure you have those copied down into your notes because we're going to be referencing back to that. So we went through and we saw I squared, I cubed, I to the fourth. We had our pattern of square root of negative 1, negative 1, negative I, 1. Well, if you keep going and we were to do I to the fifth, Well, we would have the square root of negative 1 5 times. So we can see that the square root of negative 1 times square root of negative 1 is negative 1 times negative 1. So then we have 1 times the square root of negative I. So it is just I. And you would see that the pattern as we go through is it keeps cycling through square root of negative 1, negative 1, negative I, 1, back to square root of negative 1. And as it keeps cycling, so these are our possible answers. I, negative 1, negative I, 1, no matter how high our exponent gets. So we can always simplify down any I to those 4 answers. That's why we want to make sure we have those down in our notes, because we're going to keep coming back to it. So if we want to go ahead and simplify something like I to the 15th or I to the 29th, we have 4 options. So our largest option is I to the 4th, and I to the 4th simplifies down to 1. So we always want to take out as many I to the 4ths as possible in order to simplify this. So if I have I to the 15th, I have 15 i's, so I could have I to the 4th, that's 4, 8, 12. If I have one more, that gives me 16. So I would have I to the 3rd. Well, I to the 4th is 1, I to the 4th is 1, and I to the 4th is 1. So I'd have 1 times 1 times 1, which is just 1. 1 times I to the 3rd is I to the 3rd. And we know that I to the 3rd equals negative I. So I to the 15th simplifies down to negative I. So if I think of I to the 29th, always think of, okay, what is it divisible by? What's the closest thing divisible by 4? Well, 28 is divisible by 4, so I could break this down to I to the 28th, and I'd have 1 I left over. Well, I to the 28th, if I have I to the 4th times 7 times I, well, I to the 4th is 1. 1 to the 7th power is 1. So I just have I left over. So that would be I to the 29th simplified. So now in your notes, copy down I to the 42nd and try to simplify I to the 42nd. If you were to go ahead and simplify I to the 42nd, think, okay, what is 42 divided by 4? Well, 42 divided by 4 doesn't go in evenly. So what will go in evenly? Well, I to the 40th. So if I break this down to I to the 40th, I have 2 left over. So I have I to the 40th times I squared. Because remember, when we multiply powers, we add their exponents. So that would give us I to the 42nd power. So then I to the 40th would simplify to I to the 4th times 10 times I squared. So this is going to break down to 1 times I squared. Well, we know I squared is -1, so we have 1 times -1, making I to the 42nd simplify down to -1. So remember, you have 3 options: I, -1, negative I, or 1. So the last thing for this unit is simplify these radicals. So I have the square root of -18 and the square root of -64. Back in the beginning and back in prior units, we always said, well, these are no solution. Well, now we have our imaginary unit of I, that we can use to actually go ahead and solve these. So I'm going to do the square root of negative 64 first. So if we have the square root of negative 64, well, this can get broken down into the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 64, because negative 1 times 64 is negative 64. Well, now we know that square root of negative 1 is I, and the square root of 64 is 8. So our answer would be 8i. So now if we go back and look at the square root of negative 18, we can split this up. Square root of negative 1 times the square root of 18. When we know that square root of negative 1 is going to be I, square root of 18, we can go ahead and break that down. So if I break 18 down, I have 2 times 9, and then 3 times 3. So it's going to be 3 radical 2. So I always take my number times I and then what's left over. So I would have 3i radical 2 as my final answer. So go ahead and breaking down that square root. But the big picture here is we can split it up into the square root of negative 1 times the square root of our number, and then we can actually go ahead and solve this using our imaginary unit to get an answer rather than saying that we have no solution.